Yeah, welcome to class. If it's your first time being in one of my classes, the way that I like to do kind of textual studies like this, I try to have an outline for you. I will try also and provide a folder for all of you. We did that for when we walked through the book of James, just so you can kind of keep things together if you want. I'll try to get on that this week and get some folders. But the outlines are just, for you to just have something to follow along with while we're walking through the text. Kind of keeps you engaged a little bit, and they're good for you to have and go back and reference. I'll tell you at the onset of this, I don't know how long this is going to last. All right, with textual studies like this, I'm not one to have, all right, I've got, 15 lessons and we're going to cover the material and get through the material and be done by the end of the quarter. That's not how I go. We walk through the text. If we happen to land on something in the text and I don't even get through all of my material, I'm fine with that. Because I think sometimes the times where we really learn is sometimes when we do get off track, so to speak. Okay? So I'm not one to just get through the material and push through the material that I have. If it takes a year, it takes a year. How long did we walk through James? 10 months? Yeah. And hopefully we learned a lot. But guys, Scripture is so rich. Scripture is so rich with so many things, and I'm not one to push God's Word. I'm not one to rush through God's Word. I don't want to do that. I don't want to stay parked on something for 2 years or anything. But what I'm saying is I'm not going to rush through this. Okay, there's things that I want us to get. There's things that we can learn. Okay, and we're here to learn. So anyway, that's a little bit about that. But with this whole study of Mark, I don't know how many of you have walked through this study or not. It might be different. It might be the same that you've always heard. I don't know. But I'm going to walk through it almost kind of verse by verse. But, there may be some things we can just kind of skim through. But I don't want to leave too much on the table. And I want to walk through and get what we need. I've entitled this, Who is Jesus? A study in the Gospel of Mark. And I think as we go through, we'll figure out why. But Mark definitely tries to portray that to his readers about who Jesus is. We'll see that as we go. But that's what I've entitled it as. And today will mostly be introduction material. Probably the next lesson will be as well. Until we get, and then we can kind of jump into the text. But anyway, any questions at the onset of this before we get started this morning about anything? I'm looking forward to a great study. I'm glad that you have chosen to be here and go through this all together with us. So anyway, let's get started. All right. Also, one last thing. I try to record these. I'm wearing one right now. I try to record the audio at least, and I put them on our YouTube channel. So if you happen to miss one or something like that, I try to be diligent in putting those on the channel. Okay, if you don't know what the channel is, it's just Medill Church of Christ with our gold logo. You can find it on YouTube. Anyway, and I might try and do a video series over this as well. This is just extra opportunities in case you miss or whatever. But anyway, that being said, we'll go ahead and get started. So, with the introduction material, sometimes I just believe that there's value in going over some things up front and kind of in an overview type of way before you just jump into chapter 1, verse 1. Okay? I think we do that sometimes, but what can we learn beforehand before actually jumping into the text? If you can go over, who the author is, if you can look at different things that help you understand who the audience of the letter is, or maybe if you can nail down the time in which the letter was written, or go over a summary of what the purpose of the book is, or the overall structure, then I think all of that helps us in understanding more of the context and how certain things fit, right? Rather than just looking at, one verse at a time or one section or something like that. Now, sometimes finding that information is a little bit difficult, but I do believe that it can help us understand things contextually and as a whole, okay, as you go throughout the book. Being able to see at least some of the book as a whole rather than just those individual verses. I hope that makes sense, but that's kind of how I like to approach these books. So what I want to try and do first is handle these 4 questions. Let me turn this off real quick. Well, I turned one on. Anyway, I want to try and handle these 4 questions, all right? Authorship, okay? It's pretty obvious. Who wrote the book, right? Who wrote this letter? Place. Where might the author have been when he did write the letter? Obviously, the audience. Who is this being written to? And then, for what it's worth, the time and the date. All right, so number 1, who wrote the book, right? Who is the author? Well, I think this has a bearing on how we read the book because, they may have a particular style in which they write in, the writer. Depending on who is writing, there may be some words that are used differently, right, as opposed to how another writer uses those words. So figuring out, who wrote the book, it is important. But the author of this letter, and I don't think it's any surprise to any of you, is Mark. Okay, it is Mark, sometimes referred to as John Mark. All right, and we see that in Acts chapter 12. We see it in Acts 12 twice, and also we see it in Acts chapter 15. John, who was also called Mark, that's one of the references. Okay, Mark, we know, used to travel around with Paul and Barnabas. Okay, he is one of the he is the son of one of the Marys in Scripture. Not exactly sure which one that would be. That's in Acts chapter 12 and verse 12. And he is also the cousin of Barnabas. How many of you knew that? Show of hands. How many of you knew that Mark was a cousin of Barnabas? I didn't either until getting into this and started studying it. I'd never realized that, but in Colossians chapter 4 and verse 10, you can see that. And I thought that was pretty cool. But I think Mark is, unfortunately so, mostly known for the issue that happened with him traveling around with Paul and Barnabas. All right? In Acts chapter 12, in verse 25, it says, it tells us that Barnabas and Saul took John, who was also called Mark, with them to go on the first missionary journey. Okay? Taking along with them John, who was also called Mark. So they get sent out, they sail to Cyprus, they reach Salamis or Salamis, however you pronounce that, and Acts chapter 13 and verse 5 tells us that that they also had John as their helper, and that would be John Mark. Okay? They go through the whole island of Paphos. They go from one end to the other as they're traveling about and teaching God's Word and so on. They end up converting the proconsul Sergius Paulus. But then in Acts chapter 13 and verse 13, it tells us, it says, "Now Paul and his companions put out to sea from Paphos, and they came to Perga in Pamphylia. But John left them and returned to Jerusalem." All right, so for whatever reason, John Mark, Barnabas' cousin, left them in Pamphylia and he went back to Jerusalem. Text doesn't necessarily say why, but in Acts chapter 15, okay, when Paul and Barnabas are getting ready to go out again on their second missionary journey, They want to go back to the cities that they first proclaimed the word of the Lord to, and they want to just go check up on all of those people. Let's go see how they're doing. All right? And then in Acts 15, verses 37 through 40, look what it says. Barnabas wanted to take John, called Mark, along with them also, but Paul kept insisting that they should not take him along. And listen to the language, who had deserted them in Pamphylia and had not gone with them to the work. And there occurred such a sharp disagreement that they separated from one another, and Barnabas took Mark with him and sailed away to Cyprus, but Paul chose Silas and left, being committed being committed by the brethren to the grace of the Lord. All right, so Paul did not take too kindly to what had happened back in Pamphylia, okay, with John Mark. And now Barnabas wants to take his cousin along again, but Paul doesn't want somebody traveling with them that he cannot depend on. Now, again, I thought it was interesting that Barnabas and Mark are cousins, and I think that speaks a little bit now more to why he advocated for him so much. It's like, this is my cousin, you know. I'm not just going to drop the hammer on him that bad, Paul. And maybe that is kind of why also. But anyway, Paul didn't want to travel around with somebody that he couldn't depend on. I can understand that, all right? They've got some serious work that they're trying to do, all right? We've got some stuff that we're trying to get done. I can't be traveling around with somebody that's just going to leave us hanging and desert us. So I understand. I can get where Paul is coming from. Maybe you can too. You know, is that going to happen again the way that he did the first time? But anyway, they separate. Paul goes on with Silas, and Mark and Barnabas head on back to Cyprus. But of course, what is kind of cool to see is that later on, when Paul writes the letter to Philemon, okay, Philemon, a very short letter, but he tells him in Philemon 24 that Mark is with him, and look how he describes Mark, a fellow worker. A fellow worker. And then also, we see in 2 Timothy 4, verse 11, he says, only Luke is with me, as he's writing to Timothy. Only Luke is with me. Look what he says there. Pick up Mark. Pick up Mark. Bring him with you. And now what's he saying? He's useful to me. He's useful to me for service. So at some point, I think Paul, either they met back up and they resolved some of their issues, or Paul, after that instance, you know, maybe he was like, well, maybe I was a bit too harsh and he was useful to us. I want you to bring him with me. I don't know. Okay, but at some point that got resolved. You know, Mark may have been a younger man at the time whenever they first took off on that first missionary journey. May have been a young man. And now maybe he has had some time to grow up a little bit. I don't know. But he sees him as useful now and a fellow worker. And I think part of that can be attributed to the work and influence that his own cousin had on him, Barnabas. Barnabas was the one that gave him a second chance. And obviously I think there's a lesson in that for us. You know, don't give up on people. People can, you know, they can still do good with a second chance, all right? But I'm certainly glad that he did get that chance, because he ended up penning this gospel that we were about to study and walk through, which is really cool. All right, so that's a little bit about his background to Mark. Mark certainly is a guy that has experience. He has missionary experience. He spent a lot of time around the Apostle Paul, and Mark was a worker in ministry. That's who we're reading, those writings. Okay, so a legitimate guy. Okay, now he also has an interesting connection with Peter. Now, sometimes people look or they view the Gospel of Mark kind of like it is the Gospel of Peter. There are some compelling reasons for this, in which we'll look at in just a second. But part of that is because of the relationship that Peter had with Mark's family, actually. Okay? If we look back to Acts chapter 12, go to Acts chapter 12 for just a minute. Okay, you remember when Peter was in prison? Peter got broken out of prison by an angel. All right? Well, the first place that he runs to, look at Acts chapter 12, verses 13 and 14. Somebody read 13 and 14 of Acts 12.
And when he knocked at the door of the gate, a maid came to answer, named Rhoda. And when she knew Peter's voice, she opened not the gate for joy, but ran in and told that Peter stood before the gate.
So, where is the first place that Peter runs to after being broken out of prison?
You look back at verse 12, it tells you he runs to John's house, which was also known as well.
Yeah, he ran to Mary's house, or Mark's house. And the servant girl Rhoda that lived there, she comes to answer the door, but notice that she recognized his voice, right? She didn't even open the gate to see who it was. She had recognized who it was simply by the voice that was speaking on the other side. She recognized that it was Peter, all right? And so, there might be an indication there that Peter was around Mark's house and around Mark's family a lot, right? Enough that even the servant girl Rhoda could recognize who it was simply just by his voice, right? So that's an indication there, kind of showing maybe the relationship that Peter and Mark had and that Peter had with his family. Okay? Now, there are also a number of writings outside of the Bible, okay? They are known as the early church fathers. Anybody ever heard of that? It's a collection of writings, actually, in several books. They're called the Ante-Nicene Fathers, but we reference them as the early church fathers. I don't know if anybody's ever heard of that. Dwayne, you probably have. I know you study some historical stuff a lot. But these are basically guys that wrote very close to the time that the apostles lived, okay? These early church fathers. That's what they're referenced as, okay? And so we're looking at about 120 to 200 AD, so way, way, way back, all right? Or close to that time at least. But they were quite close to the first century. These early church fathers, again, it's a collection of books that you can find, you can read, okay? They're historical, but they speak a little bit to the history of the church and things that were going on in that time period, okay? They're not inspired writings. They're not inspired like the good book is. Okay? They are outside sources. But they are historical writings that shed some light on a few different things. Now, one of the writers that is included in these early church fathers, one of them, the guy's name is Irenaeus. All right? His name is Irenaeus. He wrote around the time 180 AD, I believe. Look what he says in one of those writings. He says, Matthew also issued a written gospel among the Hebrews in their own dialect. Okay, we would know that to be the book of Matthew, which is true. While Peter and Paul were preaching at Rome and laying the foundations of the church. After their departure, so after they died, he says, Mark, the disciple and interpreter of Peter, did also hand down to us in writing what had been preached by Peter. Now that's pretty interesting, okay? And for what it's worth, there's your reference with the Apostolic Fathers, if you want to go and look at that. Okay, so there's that entry. You also have another entry in what is called the Fragments of Papias. Okay, it is also kind of part of the early church father writings, I think, but He was the bishop of Hierapolis. Okay, and it says, Mark, having become the interpreter of Peter, wrote down accurately whatsoever he remembered. It was not, however, in exact order that he related the sayings or deeds of Christ, for he neither heard the Lord nor accompanied him. But afterwards, as I said, he accompanied Peter, who accommodated his instructions to the necessities of his hearers, but with no intention of giving a regular narrative of the Lord's sayings. Wherefore, Mark made no mistake in thus writing some things as he remembered them, for of one thing he took especial care, not to omit anything he had heard and not to put anything fictitious in the statements. These are what historical guys are writing about Mark. They're pretty compelling things. Okay, that one was in the fragments of Papias. All right, so Mark was definitely hanging around Peter. All right, now even when we go back to the Bible, if we look at 1 Peter, Peter writes about Mark and he says, she who is in Babylon in 1 Peter 5:13, chosen together with you, sends you greetings, and so does my son Mark. All right, so now we see that Peter saw Mark as a son in the faith, if you will. Okay, it's much like how Paul viewed Timothy and Titus. You remember when Paul wrote to Timothy and when he wrote to Titus, look how he references them. In 1 Timothy 1:2, to Timothy, my true child in faith. To Titus, in Titus 1:4, he references him as to Titus, my true child in a common faith. Okay? So it seems that Peter and Mark kind of had that same kind of relationship. All right? Any questions so far or anything? Good? Okay. But Irenaeus says that Mark was acting as the interpreter to Peter. Okay? What's going on with that? It's not necessarily that he was translating anything into a different or new language. But what Mark may have been doing was acting like a recorder or acting like a scribe to Peter. Right? There is a more technical term for this. It's called an amanuensis, which means it's kind of like a secretary or maybe an assistant, if you will. An assistant in dictation and writing things down. Okay, so if I was just walking around going along, and I would have somebody writing for me, somebody following me around, maybe a recorder, a scribe, a secretary. Okay, that's kind of what that would be, his interpreter. All right, but also according to Irenaeus, this was after Peter and Paul had died that Mark writes what Peter had taught. And it's interesting that Mark refers to Peter a lot in Mark's gospel. And even in the gospel, there are some indications that Mark did have a close relationship with Peter. All right, so again, Mark was a guy that hung around Paul, hung around Barnabas, hung around Peter. He has missionary experience. Had a relationship with all of those big dogs, if you want to call them that, okay, that we like to think of Peter and Paul as. And that's who the author is. That's Mark. All right, so he's legit. He's got some legitimacy behind him. All right, there's the author. Let's talk about the place. When we talk about the place of writing and where Mark may have been when he wrote this, it does appear that he is at least near Rome. I think the 1 Peter chapter 5:13 passage again sheds some light on this. She who is in Babylon, chosen together with you, sends you greetings, so does my son Mark. Babylon was a reference to Rome. Okay? We see that also in the book of Revelation. Babylon was a reference to Rome. And so it appears that Peter is sending greetings from there, or at least around there. Okay? And Mark is with him. Another outside source document that may allude to that, it is part of what is called the Anti-Marcionite Prologues. The author really is unknown in this, but in one of those writings known as the Prologue to Mark, It says, Mark declared, who is called stump-fingered, because he had short fingers in comparison with the size of the rest of his body, he was Peter's interpreter. After the death of Peter himself, he wrote down this same gospel, and look what it says, in the regions of Italy. Okay, so it seems that Mark is at least writing from somewhere in that region, which brings us to the audience. All right. Now, another interesting fact, I don't know if it's fact, but his short fingers. He may have been known for that. I don't know. Short fingers compared to the rest of his body. I don't know. But the point here is that it's in the regions of Italy. That may be where he's writing. All right. Now let's go and talk about the audience. Okay, who is Mark written to? When you start getting into the structure of the book, there's a lot of indication that would say that he is writing to Gentiles or a Roman audience. Okay? Again, that kind of makes sense if you believe that he was in the regions of Italy, okay, Rome. But there are indications that that may be who he's writing to. They may be Christians, but they're Gentile Christians. Okay, one indicator of that would be that Mark tends to go out of his way to explain Jewish customs. Okay, I think that might be on your outline as one indicator. He tends to go out of his way to explain what these Jewish customs are. Look at Mark chapter 7 for just a minute. Mark chapter 7, and somebody read verses 1 through 4. Kind of lengthy, but read 1 through 4.
Now when the Pharisees gathered to him with some of the scribes who had come from Jerusalem, they saw that some of his disciples ate with hands that were defiled, that is, unwashed. For the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they wash their hands properly, holding to the tradition of the elders. And when they come from the marketplace, they do not eat unless they wash. And there are many other traditions that they observe, such as the washing of cups and pots and copper vessels and dining couches.
You notice anything in particular with verses 3 through 4? Okay, he talks about the traditions, but there is a parenthetical there in the text, isn't there? There was, at least in my Bible. Is it in yours? In verses 3 through 4, there's a parenthetical, right? It's an explanation. Okay? And he's explaining to them about this washing of hands and things that are clean, and he goes on to explain that in the text, actually. Now, if you're writing to somebody that is familiar with something, do you need to take the time to explain whatever it is? Yes or no? No, I wouldn't. Not necessarily. If somebody understands what you're talking about, then I don't have to go and, spell it out for you. But that's what he does here. Okay? Here that's not the case. He does explain this matter about the disciples eating with unwashed hands and how the Pharisees and Jews would have saw that. That's one indicator that he's not writing to a Jewish audience. Look at Mark chapter 15. Somebody grab Mark 15, verse 42. Okay, very short verse, but it seems that he takes a moment to explain when the preparation day is, which would help somebody who is not Jewish understand, right? Because it was the preparation day, that is the day before the Sabbath. Well, I think Jews would know that, right? Yeah, definitely. Okay? Now, the other things that further supports who the audience may be is when Mark uses certain terms. He uses terms such as centurion. He uses denarius. Those are Latin terms, Roman terms. But he also translates Aramaic terms. Look at Mark chapter 5. Somebody grab Mark 5, verse 41. This is in the healing of Jairus' daughter.
And taking the child by the hand, he saith unto her, Talitha cumi, which is being interpreted, Damsel, I say unto thee, arise.
I can't get over your King James rendition of some of the verses we read. Anyway. Oh, yeah, ASV, I forget. Nothing wrong with it, it's just funny. But you see there is another parenthetical in the text, in that verse. Okay? Talitha cum, Jesus says, which translated means, little girl, I say to you, get up. Okay? So it's an Aramaic phrase which Jewish people would have understood. Aramaic and Hebrew are very closely related. Okay? They would have understood what that meant, and so there would be no need then for the translation there. Okay? Flip over to chapter 7. What does 7:34 say?
And looking up into heaven, he sighed and said to them, Ephphatha, that is, be open.
Okay, so another Aramaic term that he translates there, Ephphatha, or however you pronounce that, and it means be opened. Well, if I'm a Jewish person, I understand Aramaic and Hebrew, I don't necessarily need the translation there. All right? Again, just indicators that he's writing to a Roman or a Gentile audience. Now, there's another one. Okay, it's kind of more subtle. But in Mark chapter 10, all right, in Mark chapter 10, he's going over Jesus' teaching about divorce. But there is a small little detail in here that would also lend itself to a Gentile audience. Okay? I want you to look at Mark chapter 10, verses 11 and 12. It says here, and he said to them, whoever divorces his wife and marries another woman commits adultery against her. And if she herself divorces her husband and marries another man, she is committing adultery. All right, the small detail that we can look at in this is when he says, if she herself divorces her husband and marries another man, she is committing adultery. Okay, in the Jewish culture, a woman could not be the one to issue the man a certificate of divorce. The woman couldn't do that in the Jewish culture. The man gave the certificate of divorce, okay, to his wife. But in the Roman culture, it was a little bit different. The women were allowed to issue the men a certificate of divorce. All right? And so it seems that by adding that additional feature to this, it sheds a little bit more light maybe as to who he is writing to, because the woman divorcing the man would be a Roman cultural thing. Does that make sense in that? A little bit of difference. Yeah.
I mean, I'm not disagreeing with what you're saying, but I'm curious. So the Jews moving into a Christian culture would have been opened up to that kind of tradition, wouldn't they? Like in the sense that then a woman could issue her husband a certificate of divorce under the Christian law instead of under the Hebrew law?
What do you mean by Christian law?
Like, under the gospel, I guess. Because
I mean, it was simply just a cultural thing for the Romans to do that. The Jews had their thing that had been kind of set up as far as all of that goes with divorce and all. It was just, the point is, it's just a different culture and how they were doing it. Does that make sense? Anyway. Okay, so those are some reasons as to why it seems that Mark is writing toward a Gentile Roman audience. All right, so he tries to help out us as readers a little bit with some explanation. Okay, And it also kind of helps us because what are we? Yeah, we're Gentiles. Okay? We are not Jewish, okay? At least not to my knowledge. I don't think anybody in here has come from Judaism or anything like that. Okay, we are very much Jewish. We're very much Roman. Now I'm getting confused. We're very much Gentile or Roman in that sense, okay? Anyway, no, I'm not Jewish. All right. Moving on now to the time and the date, okay? If it means anything to you guys, as far as that goes, time and date, we're looking at about 67 to 70 AD. History would tell us that Peter died about 67 to 68 AD. Okay? And then in that Irenaeus reference, if you remember, he says that Mark wrote after the death of Peter and Paul. Okay? Now, so there's not a lot of wiggle room here as for when exactly he may have written. But 70 AD is at the top end of that because, do you remember what happened in 70 AD historically? Okay, the destruction of Jerusalem happened. Okay, when Rome and the Gentiles and all them, they leveled the place. Okay, that's what happened in 70 AD. So that's at the top end of that because Mark writes about the destruction of Jerusalem in a way that it is still coming. Okay, you can't necessarily, go back and write as if it's already happened, necessarily. He writes as if it is coming still in the future. 70 AD hasn't happened yet. All right, so if he wrote after Peter and Paul's death, and Peter died about 67, 68 AD, there's not a lot of wiggle room in there. So we're looking at 68 to maybe somewhere 70 AD. That's kind of where we get that. As far as time and date goes. May have been the first gospel written. All right. Now another thing, kind of as we go throughout this, that's a bit on the intro. There's a bit more in the intro, but as we go throughout this book, we're going to try and stick to Mark's gospel. Okay? Sometimes when we're studying or reading through one of the gospels, sometimes we tend to jump over into another gospel to try and explain something that is in this gospel, right, that we're reading, okay, which would be Mark. There are times when we can do that, and it's not exactly wrong because sometimes there is additional information that we can learn and see, but we've got to understand that Mark, and really within all of the Gospels, there is a purpose to their writing individually. Okay, they may include certain things. They may exclude certain things. But there may be a purpose for that. Okay, either it's because of who they're writing to, or it may be how they're trying to portray Jesus. But we have to look at Mark's gospel and think of it in, from the lens of, okay, if I only had Mark's gospel, if I only had the gospel of Mark, then what is Mark's gospel trying to say? Okay? What is Mark trying to teach us from his writing? What is he trying to show us about Jesus? What is it that we need to be getting from Mark? Okay? So if we didn't have the others to study or cross-reference, what could we look at within Mark to see what he's trying to teach us? That's how we need to look at this. Okay? And that's how I'm going to try and go about it. Minus a few times, of course, where it may be acceptable to jump in and go briefly look at another gospel. But that's kind of how I want to do, is primarily stay within the Gospel of Mark. But Mark has a different purpose to his writing as opposed to the other Gospels. And he also uses the teachings of Jesus in that way. He may take and use them a little bit differently than the other Gospels do, and the other writers. But it's our job to figure out and learn why he is using it in this way and what's the message that we're supposed to get. All right? So next time we'll kind of talk more about the purpose, maybe the structure a little bit of the gospel and how it breaks down a bit. But that's kind of all for today.